So I wanted to make a video in light of the recent events surrounding George Floyd's death and how I've been reflecting on it, not just as a person, as a human, but also um, as someone who is part minority. I'm half Puerto Rican, and who has a wife who is Asian and children who are half Asian and a quarter Puerto Rican, and what that means potentially for them, and also as an RC hobbyist. And um, I guess in some sense, I want to focus mostly on what this means for me with regards to RC cars as a hobby. Like, how are these things related? Um, and I by no means am I out to generalize the practitioners of any hobby, but I have made certain observations within uh, you know the the region that I practice radio controlled cars, and it's even though I've made some really great friends in RC, and some of my coolest friends and most interesting friends have come from RC, and I've learned a lot from them, not just about the hobby itself, but also about life and politics. I've had some really heated political debates with some of my RC friends who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from me, but we can have that debate in a respectful fashion, and I can gain some better appreciation of where they come from. But essentially, not everyone in this hobby is a good person, and that goes for any profession, obviously. Um, but it was kind of surprising to me when I look back at my time when I used to go racing regularly before I had kids, how prevalent that was, um, and how unfortunate it is, and I guess before I really get into that, I just want to try to articulate what does this have anything to do with George Floyd? Well, George Floyd died because of, let's be honest, a couple of racist cops. Like, that's pretty obvious. And, you know, everything that happened after that in terms of the breakdown of our institutions to, reassure the public that these people would be held accountable, and the breakdown of public trust to the point where people were protesting and even rioting in the streets, um, and the breakdown even in the police response to these protests and riots. Um, it forces us to ask deeper questions about race and how it applies to different aspects of our lives. And so we could probably go on forever about this, you know, all day, but I figured, okay, well, maybe I can just try to confine that to RC and some of the things that I've observed. And surely, I have friends in the hobby who have been, vastly more impacted by racism in RC than I have. I guess I'm pretty lucky in that it hasn't really impacted me directly. Um, but I would say I've met people who have been impacted by it, and I've also met people who themselves, in my eyes, are kind of racist. And I just think about, like, what is that? What does that mean for the hobby? For instance, like, one day I'd like to get my son into this hobby and go racing with him, and it's something that, you know, for a host of reasons, I think would be a great thing because he can learn how to use his hands, how to use tools, how to, exercise mechanical sympathy, and, learn, like, responsibility, and with his tools and with his machinery, and learn to build character, while racing, and how to handle decisions under stress, under the stress of a race. And there's all kinds of things that you can get out of RC that you really can't get from one single hobby anywhere else. And that's why I love this hobby. But at the same time, I have to be, I have to recognize that not everyone in this hobby is a Nobel laureate. Okay, let's be honest. Um, you know, there are a lot of people in the hobby who are, uh, by no means do I question their sincerity toward the hobby or their love of the hobby, but they come from a different place, and it's just kind of interesting that like I rarely meet people who have a similar I'm going to get in trouble by saying this, but I'll just say it anyway. I rarely meet people who have a similar educational background that I have. And by no means do I mean that in a prejudiced way, that somehow if you don't have, a graduate degree, that makes you, less of a person or less smart or anything like that. But I find it interesting in all the people that I know. Like, if I look at all the people I know at work and all the people that I met in college and in graduate school, and what fraction of them are into radio control cars, it's almost zero. And yet when I go racing, for the times that I could, or at least when I used to go racing, I saw all these people from different walks of life that had nothing to do with the life that I lived up to that point. And so obviously they had some different life experience to inform their worldview than what I had been used to seeing and interacting with. And that's probably why I learned so much from them, because I was used to being surrounded by, my fellow PhD students at UC Berkeley, and, my fellow engineering students at, RIT, and, my fellow coworkers, and so on. And so, like when you're in that environment of common people, um, not everyone has the same worldview, of course, but you tend to have some homogeneity in how people see the world and how they approach, civil discourse over disagreements, and how they approach, a whole host of political topics, and the rest of it. And I guess I just got used to being around people who I generally agreed with. And so getting involved in RC actually forced me to confront my own views on a host of policies and politics in general. And, you know, I, I try to keep an open mind, and I'd like to think that, I've had the maturity to actually evolve the way I view these things, in no small part because of how my friends in RC have forced me to reevaluate, what I think is right and wrong. And I value that very much. But again, at the same time, like, there are some really toxic elements to this hobby and people in this hobby that I really fear for kids, and especially my son, but really any child who gets involved in the hobby. And, maybe this is a regional thing. Maybe it's just in certain parts of the country or in the world where, you get involved in radio controlled cars, and you're subject to, on a regular basis, people who are constantly swearing and, using abusive language when they don't really need to, because they're not very articulate. They never learn how to be articulate. They have a very primitive worldview, and in some sense it's unhealthy to expose children to that when you're trying to teach them the difference between right and wrong, and you have these very, strident people with very strident views on, like, for instance, in cases like this, like, how people can have such blind deference to authority, and how, anyone who the police harm, it's somehow the victim's fault, because if only they complied, they would have, they would have been okay, they'd still be alive, and all this, bullshit. And it's like, do I really want in the case of my kid or any kid, do I want their minds to be poisoned by people who are just so narrow and ignorant, by by taking my son racing every weekend? Again, I'm not saying that all racers are like this. I'm just saying that I do see people like this when I go racing, certainly more so than I see in my daily interactions with my coworkers at work and, the people I've known throughout college, because that's, it's a different environment. And I struggle with this because there's so much that you can learn from this hobby, especially as a kid. But kids are really impressionable. And, you know, I worry so much about him getting his mind poisoned by being around enough of the wrong people. Like, you can go to a racetrack and find like two or three really good guys who really care, and maybe they have kids too, and so they get it. Or even if they don't, they're just decent people. But you're also going to find plenty of people who are just shitheads. It's not uncommon in racing in general. It's not just RC. It's any form of racing. It's competitive. Well, not really a sport. It's competitive endeavor. So you're bound to see people who have moral and ethical bankruptcy, and maybe that's part of the challenge, right? Like, as a parent, maybe part of the challenge is for me to purposefully expose my kid to that, to show him what's wrong and to teach him what not to do. But at the same time, like, there's only so much that I'm only so strong as a parent, right? My influence only goes so far. Maybe the wave of ignorance and the and the wave of negative behavior that I see sometimes at races could be overwhelming to a kid, no matter how hard their parents try to correct for that. That I worry that there could be some irreparable impact to my son's attitude and behavior as he grows up. So like I really struggle with whether and to what extent to get him into this hobby, and at what age. Maybe when he's like 10 years old, okay, maybe when he's 10, he'll have enough, self-awareness, and he'll be strong enough in his mind to be able to withstand, the the slings and arrows of ignorance that you occasionally run into at these events. But maybe not. I mean, even 10 years old, that's still an immature age. I knew a kid once who I went racing with very regularly since he was like 12 years old. And, he did not end up any better because of racing, that's for sure. If anything, it probably made things worse for him. So, like, I don't want that to happen to my kid. But at the same time, I want to go racing and I want to share this hobby with him. So that's hard. And, I don't mean to go in circles about this, but, I think about that and how I've met enough people in this hobby who have, I guess, kind of backward views on civil discourse and the, historical context of race relations in this country, and all the rest of it, that, like, it's hard enough for me to deal with them on a regular basis, and to maintain some level of sanity. I can't imagine subjecting a child to that. Maybe it's just the region I live in. Like, maybe if I lived in a different state, who knows? I'm just guessing. Maybe Colorado or something. There'd be some racetrack in the middle of Colorado where people aren't assholes, and and then you could actually have like a healthy environment and a positive, vibrant community, within the context of RC that's actually like really good for kids. I don't see that here in the Northeast. That's for sure. I've been to 5 tracks throughout the Northeast, and I have personally had a great time at each track. I know the track owners. They're fantastic people. Most of them are fantastic people. And they run a great facility. The people that work at the facility, they worked really hard. They did all the right things for the most part. But it's not just about how the facility is run. It's also about the kind of people you attract to that facility. And it's just unfortunate that certain tracks, perhaps through no fault of their own, maybe it's just geography and just where they are, because that's where real estate is cheap. And so, you have no choice but to build a track there if you want a large track. It attracts certain kinds of people from that region. And if you're in a region that's, let's say, economically disadvantaged because that's the cheapest place to build a track and run a business, then you're going to attract people from that neighborhood. And, I don't want to say that, like, no, I'm not going to say that, but, shit. It stands to reason that if you're in those communities, you're not always going to attract the best apples to that facility. And I've seen that personally in multiple tracks where, you got plenty of people coming in from out of town and they're from more affluent neighborhoods. And so, they tend to be, let's just call it, better behaved and have more, etiquette at the track. And then, you'll have people from other tracks who are shitheads because that track might be in a place where, there's just really bad, like, ingrained negative behavior at that facility. And then, you'll have, like, the track that you go to might not be in the best neighborhood, and there are people just local to the area who are just from that neighborhood and they grew up in that environment. And so, they're not that great either. So then, like, do you want to bring your kid to that environment? Probably not. Especially if, like, they're going to, if those people develop a regular relationship with your child and, they can have a real influence on them. You don't want, as a parent, you try as hard as you can to keep negative influences away from them. Even though, it's also, I recognize the importance of testing your children and, putting them in somewhat difficult positions so that they learn to grow. I mean, I get that. But sometimes I just feel like with certain kinds of facilities, it's just a continual onslaught of the wrong kinds of characters at that place. Even though they might be in the minority, just the fact that they're there is a problem. Then you develop relationships with these people, not just at the track, but also online. So you become Facebook friends with these people, and then they start posting all this weird stuff on their timeline that's like, it's one thing if it's political, but if it's like really negatively political, like this victim blaming stuff and, borderline racist stuff, like that's when you start to realize, oh, wait a minute, that's who this person really is. And so it's like, all right, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to argue with them on this. And you try to have an argument with them and they just keep digging a hole. And eventually you start peeling away the layers of the onion of who those people really are as you argue with them more and more. And eventually you get them to say it. And, I've gotten to a point with certain Facebook associates, I'll put it that way, where I've pretty much gotten them to admit, like in no uncertain terms, that they have a negative view of people who don't share their skin tone. And I'm like, it boggles my mind that they would actually publicly admit that. And then, of course, they go and delete their post because they don't want there to be any, public evidence of this stuff. But it's like, okay, well, even if you, in knowing that, and then you go to these racetracks to race with these people, it's like, okay, well, who aren't I friends with on Facebook? And as a result, and therefore, who is this person really? Like, are they an upstanding citizen? Are they a piece of shit? as far as like what their value system is and how they view other people, and how much they care about diversity in society as well as in this hobby. Um, yeah, that's a tough one. Um, it's a tough one. Maybe if I were in a different environment, it would be easier to be comfortable taking my kid racing. But I don't know where that environment would be. Uh, you know, I I like the Northeast. I think Northeast is a fantastic place. I grew up in the Northeast. I have a good career in the Northeast. I have a nice house. Everything's great. It's just the RC racing scene in particular. I know a lot of fantastic people. I want to underscore that 10 times. I know a lot of fantastic people here in the RC scene. But there are a couple of bad apples that make me really question, you know, whether I should, whether it's a good idea to get my son involved in this. And I haven't quite figured that out. Maybe it would be better to take him to do something else, even if it doesn't provide all of the learning that RC could provide him in terms of character building and, mechanical awareness and all the rest of it. Like when I was a kid in high school, I got into Magic the Gathering because some of my friends got me into it, and like that I was really hooked on that, and I learned a lot more from RC than I ever did from Magic the Gathering. But Magic's still a really cool hobby. Like you learn a lot about math, you learn a lot about like it's basically a bunch of word problems, and you're doing a lot of strategy and forward thinking, and you know like maybe I could get my kids into that if they're interested in it. Obviously, I'm not going to force it on them. But I've gone to Magic tournaments with, seeing the same kinds of people actually, where you have, well, I shouldn't say the same kinds of people, but let's just say the same sort of broad distribution of people. So in some sense, like, you can't really avoid having to deal with, you know, maybe unsavory people is a strong term, but for lack of a better term, unsavory people. Uh, it for when it comes to competitive hobbies, and when you really start to take it seriously, and yeah, I don't know how to deal with that as a parent yet. I'm still figuring that out. And maybe it's just because my son is so young. He's only 3.5 years old, right? When he gets older and more mature, maybe I won't worry about it as much. Um, but right now, he's still so innocent and pure that yeah, it worries me what this hobby will be like by the time he's old enough to really participate in it, and how he may or may not be welcomed by certain people in the hobby. And even if he is, just even if the people are welcoming, just the attitude they have, the language they use, just the little subtle influences that they'll have on his character as he grows up, that worries me. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just talking here. I haven't really prepared any specific notes or anything, but I just wanted to try to express this view that I have, and I can only imagine that I'm not the only person who feels this way. So yeah, I don't know. I'll just leave it at that, and maybe we can have some more discussion in the comments section. So thanks for watching.